How's it going, everybody? Today, for our interview, my guest is Donald Kries. He's an attorney, former AP journalist, and the consumer advocate for the state of New Hampshire. Um, Donald, how are you doing today?
I am great. This is actually my debut as consumer advocate dressed in an aloha shirt. Usually my fans see me wearing a bow tie looking like a real lawyer, but it's summertime here at the Office of the Consumer Advocate, so we're a little more laid back. And of course, I'm wearing my Red Sox livery. So feeling good and casual and ready to have a really cool conversation with you.
Strong representation of New England. I like it. I like it a lot. So, all right. For people that what I try to do on this channel is take some time to sort of walk people that are more separated from what's happening at the state house and on the state level to just sort of get into more intricate issues and understand them from a slightly simplified position. So, let's just start off by saying, what's the responsibility of the New Hampshire consumer advocate?
We are a scrappy little independent state agency, the Office of the Consumer Advocate, and our job is to represent the interests of residential utility customers. And by utility customers, I mean all of us who use electricity, natural gas, or water from a public utility. And we are authorized to represent those interests everywhere they arise. For the most part, that means appearing as a party in proceedings before the state's Public Utilities Commission, and we also appear in regional forums and in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission.
Awesome. So that sort of gives way to the next question, which is we're going to be centering the conversation today a lot around the Public Utilities Commission. So I also want to take a moment to sort of delineate what's the job of the Public Utilities Commission. If you're the consumer advocate, it seems like we should have a better understanding of what their job is.
Absolutely. So there are certain industries under law that are considered natural monopolies. And in New Hampshire, those industries are electricity, natural gas, and water. And when the systems that provide those essential public services are owned by investor-owned profit-seeking companies, they do that on a monopoly basis. And monopolies, if left to their own devices, charge exorbitantly high prices. So to prevent that from happening under state law, the rates and terms of service are regulated, and the body that makes decisions about those rates and those terms of service is the Public Utilities Commission. So that's what the PUC does.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. So, okay, what are the key differences between private utility providers and, say, co-op structured utility providers like the NHEC? Because we have a lot of private corporations. Obviously, I'm sure everybody's familiar with Eversource or something like Unitil. So I want to sort of explore the difference in options that we have. And we have collective power offerings like the NHEC. So I want to sort of have you help explain some of this to the people that are watching.
Well, if you focus on the electric industry and you look around the country, there are basically three kinds of entities that provide electricity to people. One is an investor-owned utility. The other is a municipal utility, which is really just a utility that's owned by a city or a town or some other governmental entity. And the third flavor, which you already mentioned, is a electric cooperative. An electric cooperative is just a public utility that is owned by and operates for the benefit of its customers without any outside shareholders. What do outside shareholders want? They want to earn a return on their investment, i.e., make some money. So, why do we have them in the mix extracting profits from some public utilities? And the answer is because we think that drives innovation. And because if they, the investors, contribute their capital, that means that we don't have to rely on the public to build and maintain these systems that provide these essential public services. So there are advantages to each of those three flavors of supplying public utility service. And in fact, we do have all three here in New Hampshire.
Okay, so in your monthly column on In Depth New Hampshire, you've been fairly critical at points of the NHEC, and considering that its inherent structure should be more directly responsive and representative of consumer interests, just by the way that it is, um, why does it draw that criticism from the consumer advocate to the degree that you've sort of gone there?
Well, I personally have a long-standing fascination with and affiliation with various businesses that operate under the cooperative model. I think cooperatives, which really come out of mid-19th century England, that particular form of doing business is the original kind of socially conscious investment. And I think it's really cool and compelling that consumers own the businesses that exist to serve them. So I expect a lot out of cooperatives. I used to be the president of the biggest retail food cooperative in the state, the Hanover Consumer Cooperative Society. So I have a visceral feeling for what consumer cooperatives in particular are capable of. And I haven't hesitated to call out the New Hampshire Electric Co-op when it screws up, but I do want to put that in perspective. If you look around the country, our electric cooperative is performing pretty well compared to the way some cooperatives around the country have gone awry. Rural electric co-ops have a really interesting history. What happened is that the investor-owned utilities that developed the electric industry, they refused to wire up rural America. They just weren't interested. They felt like they couldn't make enough money doing that. So that left vast swaths of the country without electricity. That consigned a lot of people, mostly rural America, to abject poverty. And so, as part of the New Deal, we created this network of rural electric cooperatives, and we've really electrified the whole country. Electricity is available everywhere in the United States now. But here's the flaw in the electric cooperative model: it assumes a degree of vigilance among the owners of the utility, meaning the customers, that doesn't always exist. Sometimes consumers get a little complacent when it comes to their electric co-ops, and then you have abuses crop up. I mean, I think about the history of the Pedernales Electric Co-op in Texas. That was actually Lyndon Johnson's electric cooperative. It happens to have the biggest service territory in the country of any electric co-op. And there was a point not too long ago where its executives and board members were being led away in leg irons and chains because they were engaging in outright thievery. That is what happens when the members of an electric co-op are not vigilant. So my advice to member owners of the New Hampshire Electric Co-op is be vigilant. Know who you're electing to your cooperative's board of directors and watch what the cooperative is doing. And to be fair to our electric co-op, it is broadcasting its board meetings now, so you can watch what is deliberated or much of what is deliberated at board meetings, and you should do that. And if you care about electricity and you happen to be a member of the New Hampshire Electric Co-op, you should consider running for the board of the co-op yourself. I would do it in a minute if only I lived in a place that entitled me to be a member of the co-op. So, we have a pretty good electric co-op in New Hampshire. It could get better.
Cool. So, and I mean, I think it's important to note here that, like, very similar to, say, unions in the United States, right? There's they're not immune to corruption at the top end of things. There's a lot of history in terms of, say, the Teamsters or whatever. And I myself am a union member. I'm a strong supporter of unions in the country as it stands. And then cooperative models inherently allow the individual customers to have better access to, say, like a wholesale pricing model, as opposed to something that's a bit more gated, like the private industry model.
Absolutely. And just let me stress that, you mentioned the Teamsters and corrupt unions. I have no evidence that there's anything corrupt about the New Hampshire Electric Co-op. In fact, to the contrary, as far as I can tell, it is full of honorable people. Its executives and its board members are all coming to work every day, striving to do the right thing. But they're also human beings and they're fallible. And that's really the only point I'm making, that it's a really good idea for the membership of the electric co-op to just keep an eye on what their elected representatives and what the executives of their utility are doing. The New Hampshire Electric Co-op did a really remarkable thing a few years ago. It realized that the unmet need in today's rural America, and certainly a lot of their territory, is the lack of broadband access. So they formed a separate subsidiary to deploy broadband through its territory. And that was a controversial move because it created some financial risk for the co-op and sent it into a business that it isn't ordinarily involved in and wasn't necessarily expert in. But, so now we'll see how well that does. But it has meant broadband access to thousands and thousands of Granite Staters who wouldn't have that access otherwise. And in order to be a meaningful member of society today, you need access to broadband.
Right. And I mean, and I think this is sort of highlights the point that I think a lot of people often miss, and something that you're doing as the state's consumer advocate, where you're acting as, in a sense, as a watchdog on situations like this, where the point I want to make is that you don't get to have rights without responsibilities. It's kind of the flip side of the coin. And so that sort of civic duty of having to show up and actually participate and be engaged and be aware of what's happening within these cooperatives is really imperative in terms of actually making them function in the way they're intended to function.
True. But actually, now I want to argue against myself a little bit. So you mentioned at the beginning that I'm a lawyer and I'm the victim of my legal training. And so everywhere I go, I see principal agent problems. And what do I mean by that? Well, all the time we need to have agents who do stuff on our behalf. And when you use an agent to act on your behalf, you're the principal, the other person is the agent. And that's very true of electricity because none of us have the time all day to be constantly monitoring our electric usage, how much we're using, where's the electricity coming from, all of that kind of thing. And so we need trusted agents to act on our behalf. Well, I actually think an electric co-op should be and mostly is a pretty trustworthy agent. It is not a coincidence that the utility in New Hampshire that has led the way in gaining value for retail customers in the cutthroat world of wholesale electricity has been the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative. They were getting the best deals for their members before anybody else was really doing good stuff. And in more recent years, you also have the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire. That's a consortium of municipalities, and they, under community power aggregation, can actually buy electricity at wholesale for people who live in their member communities. That's another great principal agent relationship. The least desirable principal agent relationship is an investor owned company when you're not the investor. Why? Because the management of a company like that, whether it's Eversource or Unitil or Liberty or I don't know, Apple or name any profit seeking company you can, they're in business to make money for their shareholders. They are the agent of their principal, their owners, not you, their customer.
Right.
And
And
that
I
doesn't mean that they hate their customers. It just means their primary duty, really their sole duty, is to their shareholders.
Yeah, they don't answer to their customers. It's a lot of people think about it in terms of like, oh well, I'll just vote with my feet and change where I spend my money. But it's really not exactly that simple, because you can pull out and they're still not answering to you in that sense.
Right. And it's especially problematic when you talk about public utilities because, again, these are natural monopolies. And if you live in the Eversource service territory, say, you can't say, well, I'm sick of Eversource, so I'm going to get my electric distribution service from some other company. Now, you can choose a different electricity supplier, and you have to keep that distinction in your head between the poles and the wires, which are provided on a monopoly basis, and the actual juice that comes out of your outlet, the electricity, because you have choices when it comes to buying the actual electricity. And that is what the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire is in business to do if you happen to be lucky enough to live in a community that's part of that coalition. And there are other towns around the state that are doing community power aggregation through other providers other than CPCNH. That's great too.
Yeah, so I want to sort of pivot now. Regarding the slated rate increases by Eversource, which you actually just recently wrote about in your column on In-Depth NH, um, it seems to have been bolstered by the PUC. And I, what are the reasons that the PUC would be not only supportive but favorable towards the utility provider instead of the customers? I mean, like in this instance, they actually offered more money to Eversource than what Eversource was even asking for, which seems kind of silly. Um, i in terms of what's best for the actual residents of the state of New Hampshire. So are you able to sort of expand on this a little bit?
I could talk about this for hours, but so what you're talking about is the Eversource distribution service rate case that the commission ruled on July 25th. And it's important to make sure that everybody understands that we're talking about distribution service here. So that's the poles and wires. When you get your monthly electric bill, if you're a customer of Eversource, there are two distribution charges on your bill. You also pay lots of other charges on your bill. Those other charges also go up, but in the rate case, we're really or focused on the distribution charges. So Eversource originally filed for a rate increase of something like 180 or 190 million dollars, and they backed off and said, well, really just give us 102 million dollars. And the Public Utilities Commission gave them $100 million of their 100 of the company's $102 million requested rate increase. That is 98% in, I mean, I just went to law school. I didn't take calculus, but I can still do math. That is 98% of what the company asked for in terms of a rate increase. That is, by any estimation, a slam dunk win for the utility, handed to it by a state agency whose job by statute is to serve as the arbiter between the interests of the shareholders on one hand and the customers on the other. I mean, it's a fiasco. And uh, that is not the last word. So that decision came out on July 25th. By law, we and anybody else who doesn't like what the PUC decided, we have 30 days to take the first step toward appealing the decision. What's the first step? We have to file a rehearing motion with the PUC. We have to tell the PUC what we think it did wrong, and the PUC gets to rule on that. And then after the PUC blows us off again, then we can ask the New Hampshire Supreme Court to hear an appeal of the PUC's decision. And we can also ask the legislature to constrain the PUC by adopting new statutes that might point the PUC in a different and better direction. So, when you mentioned a minute ago that the regulator, the PUC, actually gave Eversource more than it asked for, what you're really talking about is the fixed customer charge. So, your
Right.
distribution charges on your electric bill are divided into two charges. One is a per kilowatt hour charge, which varies according to how many kilowatt hours of electricity you use any month. And the other charge is a fixed charge. It's the price of admission. In my column, I compared it to the price of being a member of Costco, right? You like to shop at Costco because it has good prices for groceries and other stuff you want. You have to pay Costco 65 bucks a year to go through the door. Eversource will now get something like, well, it's going to be almost 20 bucks a month every month just for the privilege of being a customer of Eversource before you start paying them on a per kilowatt hour basis for their distribution service. So Eversource actually asked for the fixed customer charge that it got of about $20 to it's like $19.80. But their expert said, you know what? That charge really should be $43 a month. And so what the commission decided, what the PUC decided was, well, we agree with that expert. So we're going to automatically raise that fixed customer charge, now $20, by $2 a year every year
Right. I
until
was
it
going to
gets
say it
way up
keeps
to
going up,
43
right?
bucks.
Like this is crazy.
Yeah, so that's illegal. I mean, and that's what I mean when I criticize the PUC for actually giving the utility more than it even asked for. I don't think that's going to hold up, and we will argue strenuously against that on rehearing, and then again, if necessary, on appeal.
So, okay, before I sort of dive into the next question that I had plotted out here, I want to actually ask a sort of a separate inserted question, which is how can you're saying we, and I would assume that means the office of the consumer advocate, but what can actual just residents do to help support you guys in the effort to get the PUC to re-examine this and change their trajectory?
Well, it's interesting because the statute, it's for those keeping score, it's RSA 541, sections 3 and 4, says that anybody can file a motion for rehearing. You just have to be a person aggrieved by the decision. So if you're an Eversource customer and you're mad as hell and you want to do something about it, you actually can file a motion for rehearing at the PUC. You just have to do it on or before July 22nd or August 22nd of this year, because that's 30 days after the previous decision. And, you just file that motion and tell the PUC what you don't like about it. I do this kind of thing all day. So I'm schooled in the applicable law. I know what the good arguments to make are, or I think I know. Alongside us in the rate case has been AARP New Hampshire. They have 200,000 members in New Hampshire, and they are a formidable force. So I expect they will probably file some kind of rehearing motion too, and then maybe some other parties as well. But
Right. Yeah.
we'll be in there doing that, and we welcome anybody who wants to join us in making those arguments. And even if you don't want to file a formal motion for rehearing, you can just write to the PUC and tell them what you think of the Eversource rate case decision. The docket number is DE 24-070. Go for it. Just put that docket number right in the subject line of your email and send it to puc@puc.nh.gov.
And so I would imagine this is kind of similar to, say, like calling your representatives or calling your senators if you have a complaint about something that they're doing in legislative sessions, right? Like it's a way to sort of show your disinterest and frustrations with the actions being taken. The idea being that the more calls they get, the more emails they receive, the more that is able to move the needle and show that they're sort of in hot water in a sense.
Another idea would be to contact Governor Ayotte. And the reason that's a really good idea, I mean, usually the PUC is pretty independent of the governor, but it just so happens that the term of the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission expired on June 30th. And as of today, you and I are having this conversation on what's today, August 7th, I think. The governor has not yet decided whether she is going to renominate the current chairman or pick somebody new. So if you have an opinion about how the PUC is doing, this would be a great time to let Governor Ayotte know what you think that could influence her decision about who should lead the agency. It's not going
Sure.
to be
So,
me.
yeah, yeah, of course. No, I think based off this conversation, I think many of the viewers will be pleased to know that you are in the position of consumer advocate here. But what I want to do next is I want to. So we're talking a lot about the PUC, but I actually want to take a minute to really like examine who we're talking about when we talk about the PUC, rather than just saying this sort of nebulous committee. Um, I want to go in just sort of case by case here. So we've got Dan C. Goldner, who's formerly of Texas Instruments. He ran for state representative in the Hillsborough District 8 as a Republican. He lost to Democratic incumbents. Um, and he drew criticism from the then executive counsel, Cindy Warmington, over his lack of experience in public utilities, just in lack of knowledge. We also have Mark Dell'Orfano, who's formerly of She and Finney and the Sector Capital Group, which is owned by Dell'Orfano's father. So it's important to kind of note that he is a lawyer, and his father was a former power plant operator and developer. So he also represented the state in a case against Andy Sanborn regarding uh, questionable practices at his casinos in Concord. So he's also been described by Lisa Linos as quote aggressive towards the public. So we're sort of getting to maybe like the motives of these people. We also have Pradeep Chapadia, who's a former senior advisor to the NHPUC. He worked in New Hampshire for 20 years related to energy. He's the co-author of Volatility and Growth in Developing Economies, Some Numerical Results and Empirical Evidence, with a guy named Stephen J. Ternovsky. It points towards the need for regulation and stability through economic coherence, as well as institutional stability. So I have sort of a few questions related to these sort of main individuals who you'll see described on the website if you go and look at the actual PUC, webpage. Um, so the first question that I have to ask is how much faith can consumers rationally expect to have in this commission when there seems to be so much emphasis from its leaders on institutional control and autonomy that is in a lot of ways oriented from the private industry.
Well, first of all, you really did your homework. That's really good. That's a thoughtful overview of the three actual human beings who happen to be serving as our three PUC commissioners right now. And as I mentioned, Chairman Goldner's term has expired. He's in holdover status right now. The governor can basically leave him in place for up to 6 months before deciding on who should really get the job, whether to renominate him or to appoint somebody else. The other thing I want to say about Commissioner Chattopadhyay, in fairness to him, is he used to work here at the Office of the Consumer Advocate. He was the assistant consumer advocate. So basically my deputy for several years. He was here before I got here, and he was certainly a capable and devoted member of our staff. He's an economist by training, and I think an economics background is quite useful for somebody serving in that capacity, because there are a lot of economic principles that come to bear on PUC decisions. As to all three of the commissioners, we've had Republican governors in New Hampshire for quite a long time now, certainly longer. Governor Sununu appointed each of the three commissioners, and each of them, I think, to one degree or another, reflects the policy preferences of the Sununu administration. So if you perceive them as sort of pro-business or pro-free market or pro-utility or pro-anything, I think you have to just credit them with pursuing the policy agenda of the person who appointed them. And all three of them are doing what they do in good faith. What I'll say about Chairman Goldner, something I really like about him is in the hearing room, he is a very thoughtful presence. He's courteous, he's respectful. If you have a point that you want to make in front of him, he will listen. And I think the tone that he sets in the hearing room is quite positive. That said, I do not agree with many, many, many of the decisions that he has made. In particular, the Eversource rate case decision. I also think that he is congenitally hostile to ratepayer-funded energy efficiency, which I think is really important. And I think he lacks the requisite solicitude for the struggles of low-income utility customers. But those are honest differences of opinion that I have with Chairman Goldner.
Sure, and that's understandable and respectable. I mean, I think as an aside, I think we sort of live in a time where it's very easy to sort of connect a disagreement on policy or how you implement something with just saying someone else is a bad person, right? And I
Sure.
don't want to get into that kind of like quagmire of a space. I mean, it's I something that I tend to try to impress upon folks is that even if you have fundamental disagreements with somebody about a particular issue, it's important to understand what you're actually talking about and whether or not you can really actually point to those issues and say, okay, well, this is actually making you somewhat of a deplorable human. That's
Sure.
not, it's just not productive.
Well,
And you're not gonna,
that yes, that's all really important to me. Why? Well, I came into office in 2016. I was nominated and appointed by Governor Hassan. Now, Governor Hassan's a Democrat, and so I only served for a year while she was governor, and then Governor Sununu took over. Well, I'm not registered in a political party, but I think you could reasonably infer that my personal policy preferences align more closely with those of Governor Hassan than they do with either of her two successors. But it's been really important to my success as consumer advocate to be able to find common ground with people who don't necessarily occupy the same part of the political or policy spectrum that I do. And so when Governor Sununu and his folks took over, my approach was to treat them with courtesy and respect. I think frankly, I think they were a little surprised, and that has
they're just
contributed
expecting
to
a
my
little partisan
longevity.
backlash. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's contributed to my longevity, right? I'm in my third term as consumer advocate, so I'm almost 10 years into holding this job. There are not very many survivors of the Hassan administration left. I happen to be one of them.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's important to understand too for folks that like uh, without being too indicting in this sense, like uh, our senators from this state are two. I think they occupy the number 2 and number 3 slots for senators that have voted in favor of Trump policy as it stands. So there's a lot of gray area here. And when I talk with you, especially considering your position right now, you really seem to be making a lot of cases directly for just the people that are trying to get by and pay their bills and buy their groceries and keep a roof over their head. So and that's, I think in a lot of ways we do hear those positions coming from more independently positioned folks rather than folks that are institutionally aligned, whether it's Democrats or Republicans at the moment. Feel free to, respond to that if you want to. I'm not expecting anything though.
Well, I would say that's an accurate characterization of kind of the way I approach my job and the way I position myself. I pride myself on having really annoyed every political actor in the state at one time or another, because frankly, they all get it wrong about energy and utilities all the time. I mean, the Democrats are far too captive of the renewable energy interests, and the Republicans are far too captive of the fossil fuel interests.
Right. Yeah, and
Story for
we'll
coffee.
get back to that too. So I just want to sort of like get into some more questions about the members of the Public Utilities Commission. So, why do they seem, like we've sort of talked about their backgrounds, and maybe folks are able to sort of infer, uh, based off of those backgrounds, why this might be the case. But I'd like to sort of hear it from you. Why do you think they favor, or at least appear to favor, uh, private institutions over, say, in this instance, Eversource? But why are they favoring that over something like pushing towards the NHEC model?
Well, they aren't in a position to encourage the conversion of investor-owned utilities to a different ownership model. Um, I mean, we could certainly, I mean, they tried this in Maine, right? So Maine had a referendum, the purpose of which was to force that state's two big investor-owned electric utilities to basically convert to a form of public ownership. And that, Maine has citizen referendums. We don't really do that very much in New Hampshire. The referendum in Maine failed, and even if that referendum had passed over there, the owners of the two electric utilities in Maine would have been paid a pile of money for their assets, right? You can't just take assets away from private owners. Why? A little thing called the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution and the takings clause in that amendment that says you can't take away private property without just compensation. So yeah, we could take Eversource, or Public Service Company of New Hampshire, it's New Hampshire subsidiary, but we'd have to pay them a pile of money. We don't have the money. So the three PUC commissioners know that. I don't know whether they think that would be a good idea or not. I would love to see the New Hampshire Electric Co-op serve the whole state, but it's just not practically possible because the three investor-owned electric utilities that we have, Eversource, Unitil, and Liberty, they're not going to give away their assets for free, and we don't have the money to pay them.
Right. And so I think something I want to ask a little bit more about is sort of the actual infrastructure here, right? So we've brought up renewable energy, but I believe at one point you said something about that renewables aren't really covering the gap as it stands. And when you look at, say, like the winter time, and we're facing, a lot more power consumption in that during that period of the year, uh, we end up facing bottlenecks regarding the sort of fossil fuel supply to actually provide power to people. So I guess if you could just sort of like help us understand sort of what the infrastructure state is right now, like how do we get our power, and sort of who's controlling what part at what point in the process. I mean, it's I guess another way to ask a question like this is to say, like, well, who owns the power lines, right? Like, who's in charge of that?
Okay, well, those are really two different questions, actually. So, who owns the power lines? Well, there are low voltage power lines and high voltage power lines. The high voltage power lines are called transmission. The low voltage power lines are called distribution. Transmission's regulated federally by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The low voltage stuff, distribution, that's regulated at the state level. All of that is owned, or almost all of that is owned by private companies. So here in New Hampshire, the dominant owner of our distribution systems and our transmission system is Eversource. So the thing that Eversource and the other utilities don't own is the generation facilities, the things that actually make the electricity. Why? Well, we used to have vertically integrated utilities. The Public Service Company of New Hampshire and its counterparts owned everything. Well, we forced them to sell off their generation. That started with the Restructuring Act passed in 1996. It took a couple of decades to get that job done, so we weren't done with that asset divestiture until 2018. We paid a pile of money for the right to force the companies to divest their generation assets. But now our electric utilities are poles and wires companies only, and the generators are owned by unregulated companies that sell what they produce into a big wholesale electricity market that operates at the regional New England wide level. So one consequence of that is that for purposes of figuring out, like, where does our electricity actually come from, New Hampshire doesn't actually exist anymore. We have a big, the pool is literally the whole region, right? So we're constantly buying and selling electricity at wholesale in a regional market that covers all 6 New England states. And you are just as the next electron that comes out of the wall socket at your house is just as likely to come from someplace in Maine or someplace in Massachusetts or someplace in Vermont as it is someplace in New Hampshire. So there's a lot of moving parts, literally.
Yeah, so I guess it's important then for us to think about this. Again, this channel generally focuses pretty specifically on New Hampshire, but we're really talking about a New England wide issue in a lot of ways. We're
Yes.
talking about the way in which we've invested or divested, as the case may be, in sort of government control over power. Now, I really want to like emphasize, because I think that just to say government control over power is might trigger some people. It's really important to me to say, when I say government control, what I really mean to say is the taxpayer and people's control over that. Because just to sort of, basic civic stuff, um our government is us, right? We elect our officials to stand in these positions to make these choices for us. So it's like our government really is a representation of the people itself. So when you say, well, I don't like or I don't trust the government, in a lot of ways you're saying I don't like or don't trust the people. And when we privatize things, when we sort of like offload that, what we're doing is we're taking away our control over these entities that will then be managing things like power distribution and what have you. So I guess I just I want to sort of like understand, because we've divested so much. I mean, you brought up PSNH. How can people, uh individual ratepayers, taxpayers, advocate more appropriately, given this system that we're in, for more appropriate and more controlled mechanisms to distribute and obtain power at a reasonable price, as we're seeing increasing inflation throughout the state?
Well, one thing I push for pretty aggressively is public awareness of a thing called ISO New England. ISO New England is a nonprofit organization. It's based in Massachusetts. It is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And under this restructured paradigm that I was talking about a minute ago, it is charged with operating our wholesale electricity markets. So it's the way that we buy and sell electricity where it's actually produced and then passed on to where it's actually consumed. And they also operate and plan the bulk power transmission system, which is the system we use to move power around at high voltage. The transmission system has become super expensive because we have built the heck out of it. Some people think we've overbuilt it. The utilities keep on investing in it. Why? Because they make a lot of money doing that, and there is not adequate oversight of the transmission system in New England. So this thing, ISO New England, it's called a regional transmission organization. It is insufficiently accountable to the public, in my respectful opinion. I bet if I stop the next 99 people I meet on the street here in Concord, probably maybe one of them would even be able to tell you they've even heard of ISO New England. But it is a extremely powerful and important organization, and it is completely unaccountable.
Yeah, so this kind of gets me to the question of sort of like, we're something I think a line people remember from Kelly Ayotte's campaign was, "Don't mass up NH," um, and while that's a funny catchphrase, I guess, it really seems to reinforce a separation between us and Massachusetts, or conversely, just other states within New England. And I guess my question for you, just in general, is like, what do you think we could do to be more regionally minded? Aside from just gaining awareness about something like ISO New England, what are sort of like other ways that people might be able to frame this in their own minds in terms of it's not just a individual states thing, but we as New England are a region that needs to be considerate of our neighbors and each other.
Well, let me just say first, I agree with Governor Ayotte about not massing up New Hampshire. I mean, my if my lot in life is to be in Boston from time to time for one reason or another, and the farther I get away from Starrow Drive, the happier I am. Really, like the less every time I go down to Boston, I think, oh, I love to watch the Red Sox, but apart from that, I'm just so happy I don't live in Massachusetts. And so I'm with the governor really about that as a kind of a big concept thing. Like, let's not become Massachusetts. But on this question of how to think more regionally, well, in the electric realm, we tend to stand apart from our neighboring states because we are the only state in the region that doesn't have a binding decarbonization goal. So we are not busy as a state trying to force the closure of our fossil fuel powered electric generation facilities the way particularly Massachusetts is. So, but even though we're not doing that, we still care about the high cost of electricity. And New England has some of the highest electric rates in the whole country. And, there are lots of reasons why that's true. But for the most part, the reasons are common to the whole region. So we're forced to be thinking and playing at a regional level. And I think Governor Ayotte's people are doing that. Certainly, I mean, they're where uh, they participate in all of the regional forums, as do we. One thing that the Ayotte administration decided not to do is sign on to this regional transmission collaborative, planning collaborative that the other states have launched. And I think the reason the Ayotte administration decided not to do that is because it put the development of wind power, offshore wind power, front and center. And I think Governor Ayotte seems to be following the lead of the newish administration in Washington and being hostile to offshore wind power. Um, that, from my perspective as consumer advocate, that is what it is. I don't have any influence over whether we build or don't build offshore wind. The Gulf of Maine is the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind, but offshore wind turbines are expensive to build. So the Trump administration has kind of, repudiated that and is doing everything it can to stop the development of offshore wind. So I think it's not going to happen, at least not until some different set of policy preferences becomes enshrined in Washington. So in the meantime, we're going to try to build our transmission system and regulate our wholesale power markets in a way that helps people save money as much as possible. And I think those interests can and should be reconciled with some of the environmental imperatives that are driving public policy in our neighboring states.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess this sort of just last question here. I mean, we're bringing up renewable energy quite a bit. But I unfortunately I don't have it on hand to cite it specifically, but I do remember reading an article recently. I believe it was either New Hampshire Bulletin or NHPR that was talking about just sort of a divestment generally within the state towards things like solar and wind. And I'm just sort of wondering, like, uh, to what end does that help us, and how do you as the consumer advocate feel about sort of moving away from renewable energy? I mean, it's like, in my mind, I think, well, any opportunity that we have to create more power is a good thing. But that might not be the case, and I'm just sort of curious, is from your particular perspective, like, how does that shake out?
Well, what's the alternative? If you're looking, like, if you're not thinking, if you're not thinking about building more renewable capacity, not deploying more solar panels, not building more wind turbines, not using more hydroelectric power, which basically means importing it from Canada, then where do you look? The only plausible alternative to all of that is using natural gas, burning natural gas to produce electricity. And we already do a ton of that. That still is the dominant source for the production of electricity in most of the time, the exception being bright, sunny afternoons like the one that we happen to be in now as we're talking. Um, if you're thinking about building more natural gas generation, the problem you immediately confront here in New England is we don't extract any natural gas from underneath our real estate. We have to move that natural gas here somehow, either by boat or by pipelines. And we're already using all of the pipeline capacity that we have. And the more that we depend upon fuel that we move here from elsewhere, the less energy independence and autonomy we have, and the more dependent we are on the kindness of strangers to secure our energy future for us. So right now there's a lot of talk about reviving the Constitution Pipeline project. That happens to be a pipeline that, if built, would mean a pipeline that connects Pennsylvania and central New York, and would theoretically allow more natural gas to make its way towards New England. And, if that gets built, we'll be able to use some of its capacity, but it still begs a whole bunch of questions about whether that is really the best way to secure our energy future.
Yeah, I mean, it just from my perspective, it just seems to a certain degree uh antithetical to a lot of the sort of like independent minded approaches that we take in this state. It's like we really like to sort of be and act alone as much as possible. I mean, and I think that counts on regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, right? I know plenty of people that are on the left that still believe in sort of like an autonomous New Hampshire. But it's like, from my perspective, if you're removing subsidy or opportunities to add things like solar, that's going to an extent, you're talking about more power going into the market. That's ultimately going to disproportionately affect people of a lower income status. And I have to wonder, like, why? you know
Well, one thing you haven't mentioned is nuclear power. So, as I think everybody knows, New Hampshire is a big, big, big producer of nuclear energy, thanks to the Seabrook nuclear power plant in Seabrook, which cranks out 1,200 megawatts just almost all the time. That
right,
is
it's
either the
constant.
biggest, yeah, it's either the biggest or the second biggest single generator in the whole region. So that's a big deal. And one question that people are grappling with is like, should we build more of those, more nuclear power plants? Well, the answer is maybe, but nobody's figured out how to do that in an economical way, meaning that it's actually, as of now, cheaper to do all these other alternatives first. The Republicans in the legislature, in particular, are really keen on kind of paving the way for more nuclear power development in New Hampshire. I don't oppose that, but I haven't seen a business case that supports it yet. Maybe we'll get there at some point.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Donald, for just this conversation and all of the information that you've been able to supply. I think I certainly learned a decent amount, and I hope that anybody that checks out this video will also glean some valuable information for themselves. So,
Well,
yeah, again,
yeah, this has been a blast. I really thank you for the opportunity to talk about stuff, and we could do 5 more episodes talking about all
yeah,
the stuff we
totally.
missed.
Yeah, I'm sure. I only had so much time to prepare so many questions, so I didn't want to overload the conversation and have us run past our time slot. But again, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today.
Ditto.
All right, and that's it for this interview. If you enjoyed this program, this particular video, you can subscribe to our channel or support us on Patreon, and we will catch you guys on the next one. Thank you so much.